June 4, 1942. The vast Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly beneath a brilliant morning sky. The water is calm, almost peaceful, reflecting the early sunlight in 1,000 shimmering fragments. But beneath this serene surface, the fate of the entire Pacific War is about to be decided in the next 10 minutes. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron sits in the cockpit of his TBD Devastator torpedo bomber leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet. The engine vibrates beneath him, a familiar rumble that should be comforting, but today it feels different. Today feels like the end of something. He looks back at his squadron, 15 aircraft following him in tight formation. These are his men, his boys. He's trained them, eaten with them, laughed with them. And now he's leading them toward what he knows, deep in his bones, will likely be their final flight. The briefing that morning had been tense. Intelligence reports confirmed it. The Japanese carrier fleet, the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months ago, was out there. 4 massive carriers, the crown jewels of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These floating fortresses had been the spearhead of Japanese expansion, cutting through the Pacific like a hot knife through butter, seemingly unstoppable. But today, through a combination of brilliant intelligence work and what could only be called fortune, the American fleet knew where they were, and more importantly, the Japanese didn't know the American carriers were nearby. Waldron had gathered his squadron that morning, looking into their young faces, some barely out of their teens. He'd spoken words that would later become legend. He told them they were going to attack the Japanese carriers. He told them it would be dangerous. He didn't tell them what he truly believed, that most of them wouldn't return. But somehow they all knew. The TBD Devastator was already obsolete. Its top speed was barely over 100 miles per hour when carrying a torpedo. It was slow, ungainly, and desperately vulnerable. To successfully drop a torpedo, they'd have to fly straight and level at low altitude for several critical minutes. In that time, they'd be exposed to every weapon the Japanese fleet could throw at them. Anti-aircraft fire would fill the sky. And worse, much worse, the Japanese Zero fighters would descend on them like hunting hawks on field mice. The Zero was the most formidable fighter aircraft in the Pacific, fast, maneuverable, and flown by pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The Devastators had no fighter escort. Due to a series of communication breakdowns and timing issues, they would be attacking alone. Waldron knew all this. Every pilot in his squadron knew it too. As they flew across the empty ocean, Waldron broke radio silence. His voice crackled through the headsets of every pilot in Torpedo 8. He told them to follow him. He told them he knew where the Japanese fleet was. He was deviating from the planned course, trusting his instinct, his gut feeling about where the enemy would be. His instinct was correct. After 90 minutes of flying, the ocean below suddenly transformed. Where there had been only endless blue, now there were ships, dozens of ships, and in the center, unmistakable even from this distance, 4 massive aircraft carriers, their flight decks crowded with planes being armed and fueled for their own strike against the American fleet. This was it. This was the moment. Waldron's voice came through calm, almost casual. "We will go in. We won't turn back. We will attack." The 15 Devastators nosed down, descending toward wave-top level. The torpedo run had to be made low, skimming just above the ocean surface. It was the only way the weapons would work. It was also the most vulnerable position imaginable. As they descended, the Japanese lookouts spotted them. Alarm bells rang across the fleet. The carriers began evasive maneuvers, turning hard to present difficult targets. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled toward the incoming Americans. And most ominously, the combat air patrol of Zero fighters, which had been circling lazily above the fleet, suddenly dove toward the slow-moving torpedo bombers like vengeful spirits. The sky erupted. Tracer rounds arced up from the ships below, creating a web of deadly fire. The Zeros fell upon the Devastators with terrifying efficiency. Machine gun rounds punched through the thin aluminum skin of the American planes. One after another, the devastators began to fall. Waldron's plane was hit early. Flames erupted from the engine. The aircraft lurched, smoke pouring from the cowling. But Waldron held his course, flying straight toward the nearest carrier. He never released his torpedo. His plane simply disappeared into the ocean, taking him and his crew with it. Behind him, his squadron kept coming. Ensign George Gay, the youngest pilot in the squadron, watched in horror as plane after plane around him was torn apart. To his left, to his right, aircraft exploded or simply crumpled and fell. The Zeros were everywhere, their guns chattering endlessly. The air was full of smoke, flames, and falling debris. Gay kept his hands steady on the controls. His torpedo was armed. He had a target, one of the massive carriers ahead. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to escape, to save himself. But he kept going. They all kept going. 14 devastators fell into the ocean. 14 aircraft, each with a crew of 3 men, simply ceased to exist in a matter of minutes. The water below was littered with burning debris and oil slicks, marking where brave men had made their final stands. George Gay was the last. His plane was hit repeatedly, his gunner slumped in the rear seat, his aircraft barely controllable. He reached his drop point and released his torpedo. Then, unable to gain altitude with his damaged plane, he flew directly over the deck of the carrier, so low he could see the faces of Japanese sailors staring up at him in shock. Seconds later, his plane was hit again. The engine failed completely. He ditched in the ocean, watching his aircraft sink as Japanese ships passed around him. He would hide under a floating seat cushion for the next 30 hours, watching the entire battle unfold around him, the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. But Torpedo 8's sacrifice was not in vain. At the same time, Waldron's squadron was being destroyed. 2 more torpedo squadrons from other carriers were also attacking. Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise and Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown. They met the same fate. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit its target. From the Japanese perspective, they had won a crushing victory. The Americans had thrown their best punch, and it had been swatted aside with contemptuous ease. The American torpedo attack had been a complete failure, but failures sometimes create opportunities. The Japanese carriers were in chaos. They had been preparing their own strike against the American fleet, arming and fueling planes on the hangar decks. Then the torpedo bombers had appeared, forcing the carriers to take evasive action. The Zeros had been pulled down to low altitude to intercept the torpedo planes. The anti-aircraft crews were focused downward, tracking the low-flying attackers. No one was looking up. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was lost. He commanded the dive bomber squadrons from the USS Enterprise, 37 SBD Dauntless aircraft flying at 14,000 feet. They had flown to where the Japanese carriers were supposed to be and found empty ocean. Fuel was running critically low. If they didn't find the enemy soon, they'd have to turn back or ditch in the ocean. McCluskey made a decision. Instead of turning back, he would search a bit longer. He adjusted his course, following his intuition and his training. Just a few more minutes, just a bit further. Then he saw it. A single Japanese destroyer, sailing at high speed, leaving a brilliant white wake behind it. That destroyer was rushing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey altered course to follow it. Minutes later, his radio operator shouted, "There! Ships! Carriers!" McCluskey looked down and couldn't believe what he saw. 4 Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft, and not a single Zero fighter at altitude. They were all down low, still dealing with the last of the torpedo bombers. The carriers were completely vulnerable. In military history, there are moments that hinge on pure chance. This was one of them. If McCluskey had turned back 5 minutes earlier, he never would have found the fleet. If the torpedo bombers hadn't attacked when they did, the Zeros would have been at high altitude, ready to intercept the dive bombers. If the Japanese had completed rearming their aircraft 10 minutes sooner, they might have already launched their strike. But none of those things happened. Instead, at exactly 10:22 in the morning, Wade McCluskey pushed his stick forward and dove toward the Japanese carriers, his entire squadron following behind him. The SBD Dauntless was a far different aircraft from the lumbering Devastator. It was fast, sturdy, and designed specifically for one purpose: to dive nearly vertically at high speed and release a 1,000-pound bomb with devastating accuracy. As McCluskey's planes plummeted downward, the angle so steep it felt like falling, Japanese lookouts finally spotted them. Alarm bells rang again, but it was too late. The Americans were already committed to their attack runs, already screaming down through the sky at terminal velocity. McCluskey selected the lead carrier, the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Other pilots chose the Kaga, another massive carrier steaming alongside. The dive was terrifying, the aircraft vibrating violently, the wind screaming past the canopy, the target growing larger and larger until it filled their entire vision. At 1,500 feet, the pilots began releasing their bombs. 1,000 pounds of steel and explosives fell free, following a ballistic arc toward the wooden flight decks below. The first bomb struck the Akagi near the amidships elevator. It punched through the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar deck where aircraft were being armed and fueled. The explosion was catastrophic. Aviation fuel ignited, torpedoes cooked off, bombs detonated. In seconds, the Akagi's entire hangar deck became an inferno. More bombs followed. The Kaga was hit multiple times, each bomb starting new fires, each explosion setting off secondary blasts as ammunition and fuel burned. The carrier's flight deck, moments before crowded with aircraft and crews, became a scene of utter devastation. At almost the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led the dive bombers from the Yorktown in an attack on the Soryu. His squadron had also arrived at exactly the right moment, the Japanese carriers still vulnerable, still unprepared. Leslie's bombs struck the Soryu with precision, turning its hangar deck into the same kind of blazing wreckage that consumed the other carriers. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers had been mortally wounded. 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had seemed invincible for 6 months, were burning out of control, abandoned by their crews, sinking into the Pacific. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, was separated from the others and escaped the initial attack. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding from the Hiryu, immediately launched a strike against the American fleet. His planes found the Yorktown and hit it with bombs and torpedoes, severely damaging the American carrier. But the Hiryu's location was now known. That afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the lone surviving Japanese carrier and attacked. Bombs struck the Hiryu, setting it ablaze just like its sister ships. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were either sunk or sinking, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and crew. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan's carrier striking force, the most powerful naval aviation force in the world, had been destroyed in a single day. But we must return to the men of Torpedo Squadron 8, the squadron that paid such a terrible price that morning. George Gay, floating in the ocean under his seat cushion, watched it all. He saw the dive bombers attack. He saw the carriers burn. He saw the Japanese fleet retreat in disarray. And he thought of Waldron, of his squadron mates, of the men who had flown to their ends without hesitation. The next day, a PBY Catalina flying boat spotted him and pulled him from the water, sunburned, exhausted, but alive. He was the only survivor of the 15 aircraft and 30 men who had attacked that morning. When news of the battle reached the United States, it was carefully managed. The public learned of a great victory at Midway. They learned that 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. They learned that the tide of the war had turned. But for a long time, they didn't learn the full story of the torpedo squadrons, of the men who had flown, knowing they wouldn't return. John Waldron was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. His squadron, Torpedo 8, became legendary. But legends sometimes obscure the human cost. These were real men. They had families, sweethearts, dreams for after the war. John Waldron had a wife and 2 daughters. Ensign William Evans had just gotten married before shipping out. Ensign Grant Teets wrote a letter to his parents the night before the battle, telling them not to worry, that everything would be fine. None of them had to go. When Waldron looked at his squadron that morning and told them what they faced, any of them could have developed engine trouble, could have turned back, could have found a way to avoid what was coming. In the chaos of battle, no one would have questioned it, no one would have known, but they all went. Every single one of them. Why? What makes a man climb into an obsolete aircraft knowing he's facing modern fighters and overwhelming firepower? What makes him fly straight and level through a storm of fire? What makes him hold his course when every survival instinct screams at him to turn away? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't blind patriotism or suicidal heroism. It was something more complex and more human. It was loyalty to the men flying beside them. It was trust in their commander. It was belief in their mission. It was the accumulated weight of training, duty, and the simple fact that someone had to do it, and they had been chosen. John Waldron understood this. In his last briefing, he didn't try to inspire his men with grand speeches about glory or honor. He simply told them the truth. He told them what needed to be done, and he promised he would lead them, that he would go first, that he would take the greatest risk. And he did. This kind of leadership, this kind of courage, cannot be manufactured. It emerges from character, from the bonds between men who have trained together, suffered together, trusted each other with their lives. The Battle of Midway changed the course of the Pacific War. Before Midway, Japan was advancing. After Midway, Japan was defending. The loss of 4 carriers and their experienced air crews was a blow from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. But the American victory at Midway came at a cost. 41 torpedo bomber crews, over 100 men. And while the dive bombers ultimately won the battle, it was the torpedo bombers who created the opportunity. Their attacks, though tactically unsuccessful, drew down the Japanese defenses, pulling the Zero fighters to low altitude, distracting the anti-aircraft gunners, creating the brief window that the dive bombers exploited. In the cold calculus of war, their sacrifice was necessary. The strategists would later say the torpedo attacks achieved their purpose, even though they failed to hit any ships. They created the conditions for victory. That's how military historians describe it. But that clinical assessment ignores the human reality. These men didn't calculate odds or consider strategic impacts. They simply did their duty, knowing the cost, paying it without complaint. George Gay lived until 1994, carrying the memory of that day for more than 50 years. In interviews later in life, he spoke carefully about his lost squadron mates. He never claimed to be a hero. He said he was just the lucky one, the one who survived by chance when others fell. He spoke of Waldron with deep reverence, describing a commander who cared for his men, who trained them relentlessly, who demanded perfection because he knew their lives depended on it. In the weeks before the battle, Waldron had drilled the squadron constantly, practicing torpedo runs until they could do them in their sleep. He wanted them to be ready for anything. That training, ironically, prepared them for everything except surviving. The TBD Devastator simply couldn't compete with the Zero fighter. No amount of training could change that fundamental reality. Waldron knew it. His pilots knew it. They went anyway. The families of Torpedo Squadron 8 received telegrams in the days following the battle. The wording was official, carefully chosen, missing in action, presumed lost. The Navy couldn't tell them the full story. Not yet. The details of the battle were classified. All the families knew was that their sons, husbands, and fathers weren't coming home. Later, much later, they learned more. They learned about the attack, about the courage, about the sacrifice. Some found comfort in knowing their loved ones had died as heroes. Others struggled with the senselessness of it, the waste of young lives in a war that should never have happened. Eleanor Waldron, John Waldron's wife, raised their 2 daughters alone, keeping their father's memory alive, telling them stories of a man who led with honor, who never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself, who died as he lived, putting others before himself. The survivors of the Battle of Midway, the pilots who made it back to their carriers, carried their own burdens. They had watched their friends fall. They had heard the last radio calls, the desperate shouts, the silence that followed. They had flown through the smoke and debris, seeing the wreckage floating on the water below, knowing each piece of metal represented a crew that wouldn't return. Wade McCluskey, whose decision to search a few extra minutes led to finding the Japanese fleet, never forgot the cost. He knew his dive bombers had achieved the victory, but he also knew they had only been able to attack because the torpedo bombers had drawn off the defenses. In his reports and later accounts, he always credited the torpedo squadrons, acknowledging their crucial role. The tactical lessons from Midway were studied intensely. The Navy realized the TBD Devastator had to be replaced immediately. New torpedo bombers, the TBF Avenger, began reaching the fleet within months. Fighter coordination improved, tactics evolved. The mistakes that led to the torpedo squadrons attacking without fighter cover were never repeated. But no tactical improvement, no new aircraft, no better strategy could change what had happened to those 41 crews. They had flown into history, their sacrifice becoming legend, their courage becoming a standard by which future naval aviators would measure themselves. On June 4th each year, Navy veterans gather to commemorate the Battle of Midway. They remember the victory, the turning point, the moment when the war shifted. But they also remember the men who didn't come back, the crews who flew knowing the odds, who attacked despite everything, who gave their futures so that others might have one. The Pacific Ocean, where the battle was fought, is vast and deep. The wrecks of the Japanese carriers rest on the ocean floor, 3 miles down, entombed in darkness and pressure. Somewhere nearby, if you knew exactly where to look, you might find the remains of American aircraft, crushed by the same depths, bearing the remains of crews who never made it home. The water above is calm now, the same brilliant blue it was that morning in 1942. Ships pass over these grave sites without knowing what lies beneath. The ocean keeps its secrets, holds its dead, shows no sign of the violence that once erupted on its surface. But those who study history know. We remember the names, John Waldron, George Gay, and the 28 other men of Torpedo Squadron 8. We remember the crews of Torpedo 6 and Torpedo 3. We remember that victory is never free, that courage sometimes means accepting certain defeat for a greater purpose, that heroism isn't about glory, but about doing what must be done regardless of the cost. The story of the Battle of Midway, told properly, isn't just about the 4 Japanese carriers that sank. It's about the decisions made in moments of crisis, about leadership under impossible pressure, about men who faced their fears and didn't turn away. Admiral Nimitz, commanding all American forces in the Pacific, later said that the Battle of Midway was decided by 30 seconds of courage and 3 minutes of inspired tactical genius. Those 30 seconds were when the dive bombers pushed over into their attacks. Those 3 minutes were when they delivered their bombs with devastating accuracy. But that assessment, while accurate, is incomplete. The battle was also decided by the 90 minutes of sustained courage shown by the torpedo bomber crews, by their willingness to attack against overwhelming odds, by their refusal to turn back, even as their squadron mates fell around them. History often focuses on the victors, on the successful attacks, on the moments of triumph. That's natural and understandable. But sometimes the greatest courage is shown in failure, in attacks that don't succeed but still matter, in sacrifices that create opportunities for others. The men of the torpedo squadrons didn't sink any carriers. Their torpedoes missed or malfunctioned. By any tactical measure, their attacks failed. But they drew the Japanese defenses downward, created confusion, disrupted the enemy's plans, and ultimately made victory possible. In the decades since the battle, technology has advanced beyond anything those World War II aviators could have imagined. Modern aircraft carriers are nuclear-powered behemoths. Modern fighter jets are supersonic marvels. Guided missiles can strike targets hundreds of miles away. War has become more technological, more distant, more precise. But the fundamental challenges remain unchanged. Someone still has to make the difficult decisions. Someone still has to lead. Someone still has to have the courage to face danger when duty demands it. The technology changes, but the human element remains constant. When modern naval aviators study the Battle of Midway, they learn about tactics and strategy, about radar and intelligence, about the importance of timing and coordination. But they also learn about Torpedo Squadron 8, about men who flew obsolete aircraft into impossible situations because it was necessary, because someone had to do it, because they were chosen and they accepted that responsibility. That lesson transcends technology. It transcends era. It's a lesson about character, about leadership, about the bonds between warriors, about the price of freedom and the cost of victory. The Japanese perspective on the battle is equally instructive. They had trained their pilots relentlessly, created the finest carrier force in the world, achieved stunning victories across the Pacific. They believed themselves invincible, their doctrine proven, their supremacy assured. But at Midway, everything fell apart. Their intelligence failed. Their luck ran out. Their invulnerability proved illusory. In a few minutes of desperate action, their entire strategic position collapsed. The carriers that had seemed unstoppable burned and sank. The pilots they couldn't replace were lost. The momentum they had maintained for 6 months reversed completely. For Japan, Midway was the beginning of the end. They would fight on for 3 more years, with increasing desperation, watching their perimeter shrink, their forces diminish, their cities burn. But the strategic initiative passed to America that day and never returned. The 4 sunken carriers became symbols of lost glory, of a moment when everything changed, when the ascending power suddenly found itself descending. Japanese veterans of the battle, the ones who survived, carried the memory of that day for the rest of their lives, remembering how quickly fortune can reverse, how narrow the margin between victory and defeat. Some became bitter, blaming intelligence failures or bad luck or the gods themselves. Others became philosophical, seeing the battle as an inevitable consequence of Japan's overextension, of challenging a power with greater resources and industrial capacity. All of them remembered the American torpedo bombers attacking with such determination despite their losses, wondering what kind of men would press such hopeless attacks, what kind of nation produced such warriors. In both countries, the Battle of Midway became legend, studied in military academies, commemorated in memorials, retold in books and films. But legends, by their nature, simplify and glorify. They turn messy, chaotic, terrifying reality into clean narratives with clear heroes and obvious lessons. The truth is more complex. The battle was won by a combination of factors: brilliant intelligence work, personal courage, tactical skill, and simple fortune. If any one element had been missing, the outcome might have been different. If the intelligence code breakers hadn't determined where the Japanese fleet would be, the American carriers wouldn't have been waiting. If Wade McCluskey had turned back 5 minutes earlier, the dive bombers wouldn't have found the Japanese fleet. If the torpedo bombers hadn't attacked when they did, the Zeros would have been at altitude, ready to intercept the dive bombers. Each element mattered. Each contributed to the outcome. Victory wasn't assured by any single factor, but emerged from the complex interaction of many factors, some controlled, some accidental, all crucial. But amid all this complexity, one truth stands clear. The men who flew that day, especially the torpedo bomber crews who suffered such terrible losses, displayed courage of the highest order. They faced their fate without flinching, held their course without deviation, and accepted their end without complaint. That courage deserves to be remembered, not as abstract heroism, but as the specific human choice of real men in impossible circumstances. They weren't supermen or legends. They were young Americans, most in their early 20s, who found themselves at a critical moment in history and rose to meet it. John Waldron's last letter to his wife, written the night before the battle, was simple and direct. He told her he loved her. He told her to take care of their daughters. He told her he was proud to serve. He didn't mention what he knew was coming, didn't burden her with his fears, didn't seek sympathy or understanding. He simply expressed his love and his duty, the two things that mattered most to him. When Eleanor received that letter weeks after the battle, she read it through tears, understanding what it meant, what he had known, what he had faced. She kept it for the rest of her life, a final connection to a man who had been taken too soon, a reminder of love and sacrifice intertwined. The other families received similar letters, final words from sons and husbands who somehow knew who wrote with the weight of finality, who tried to comfort those they would leave behind. Reading these letters now, decades later, is heartbreaking. They're so normal, so human, so filled with everyday concerns and expressions of love. They make the loss more real, more personal, more tragic. Modern America, comfortable and prosperous, sometimes forgets these sacrifices. The generation that fought World War II is nearly gone. The last veterans now in their late 90s or older, their numbers dwindling each year. Soon there will be no one left who experienced the war firsthand, who remembers what it felt like to face an existential threat, who understands viscerally what was at stake. But the lessons remain relevant. The courage displayed at Midway, the willingness to sacrifice for something larger than oneself, the commitment to duty, even at terrible cost, these virtues don't expire. They're needed in every generation, in every era, whenever free people face challenges to their way of life. The Battle of Midway reminds us that freedom is never guaranteed, that it must be defended by those willing to pay the price, that comfortable lives rest on the sacrifices of those who went before. It reminds us that heroism isn't about seeking glory, but about doing what's necessary when called upon, about facing fear and continuing anyway, about holding the line when it would be easier to break. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 held that line. They didn't break. They didn't turn back. They flew straight into the fire because their duty demanded it. Their nation needed it. Their commander led them there. And in doing so, they helped change the course of the war, helped preserve the freedom we enjoy today, helped ensure that their sacrifice would not be in vain. The Pacific Ocean still stretches endlessly, still reflects the sunlight, still maintains its serene surface. But beneath that surface, in the dark depths, rest the remains of heroes who gave everything. They sleep in the deep, far from home, but not forgotten. We remember them. We honor them. We tell their story so that future generations will know what was done, what was sacrificed, what was preserved by their courage. We ensure that the names of John Waldron and Torpedo Squadron 8 remain in our collective memory, spoken with respect and gratitude. On that June morning in 1942, 15 aircraft launched from the Hornet flew across the Pacific and never returned. But what they did in those final minutes, the courage they displayed, the sacrifice they made, echoes across the decades, inspiring us still, reminding us what true heroism looks like, what duty demands, and what freedom costs. Their story is America's story, a narrative of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges, of citizens becoming warriors, of individuals choosing to sacrifice for the greater good. It's a story that must be told and retold, remembered and honored, so that we never forget the price that was paid for the liberty we enjoy. The Battle of Midway was a turning point, a hinge upon which history swung. But it was more than that. It was a testament to human courage, to the capacity of individuals to transcend their limitations, to face their fears, to do what must be done regardless of personal cost. Those lessons remain timeless, as relevant today as they were in 1942. They speak to something fundamental in the human spirit, something noble and enduring, something worth preserving and passing on to future generations. So we remember, we honor, we tell the story. And in doing so, we keep faith with those who flew to certain fate that morning over the Pacific, who gave their futures so we could have ours, who made the ultimate sacrifice so that freedom might prevail. Their names are carved in memorials, listed in history books, spoken at ceremonies. But more than that, they're written in the story of America, in the ongoing narrative of a nation defended by those willing to give everything, preserved by heroes who answered the call, protected by warriors who never turned back. The sky over Midway is peaceful now. The water is calm. The battle ended long ago, but the courage displayed there, the sacrifices made, the heroism shown, these things do not end. They echo forward through time, inspiring each generation anew, reminding us of what we owe to those who came before, challenging us to be worthy of their legacy. And so the story continues, passed from generation to generation, from veterans to children, from teachers to students, from America to the world. The story of the Battle of Midway, of torpedo bombers and dive bombers, of Japanese carriers and American courage, of a day when the course of history changed because men were willing to pay the price. It's a story worth telling, a story worth remembering, a story that honors those who flew, those who fell, and those few who survived to tell the tale. It's America's story, humanity's story, a story of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, of sacrifice for a cause larger than oneself, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when history called upon them. And it reminds us across the decades that freedom is never free, that courage is always necessary, that sacrifice is sometimes demanded, and that when the moment comes, we too must be ready to answer the call, to hold the line, to do our duty regardless of the cost. This is the legacy of Torpedo Squadron 8. This is the lesson of Midway. This is the gift purchased with blood and treasure by those 15 aircraft that flew into history on that June morning, never to return, but never to be forgotten.